Okay, we're live. Good. Yeah. So welcome today to Transcendent Psychotherapist. I've got the pleasure of interviewing Maria Francesca French today, who is going to be talking to us about her relatively new book, Maria, Safer Than the Known Way. So I've been following you on Facebook as well. You've been kind of, I think, globetrotting, or certainly kind of spending quite a nice time in Paris. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a bit of a Francophile. I love France. I've spent a lot of time there. I lived in south of France for a while, and Paris obviously is just such an iconic city. And I had a really big birthday coming up. I turned 40 at the beginning of the month, and we wanted to do something big for it. We were going to take, a nice holiday somewhere, and we had a lot of sort of things, on the agenda. And then my husband said, "What if we just went to Paris for a month? You love France, you love Paris, instead of like taking, some kind of, crazy holiday for a week or 10 days. How would you like to just go rent a place and live in Paris for a month?" And I thought, me. Yes, this
Yeah.
is great. So it was really, when you go to a city like Paris so much, you've been the tourist, you've done the museum thing, you've seen a lot of the sites, and now you just want some time to sort of wake up and go get a coffee at your favorite place and stroll around with nowhere to go and maybe find some new things about the city. And so that's what we did. And while I was there, a few days before my 40th birthday was my book release, January 27th, for the book that we're going to be discussing today. And so we were able to celebrate that. So it's wonderful. It was a really wonderful, beautiful month filled with a lot of love and a lot of celebration and a lot of beauty, of course, because Paris is filled with beauty.
Yeah.
And now we're back where we're living at the moment in Middle England. So
Yeah, back to England.
yeah, back to England.
Yeah. Oh, Paris is amazing. I did actually do because the French was my first degree, so I was actually there for I had time in the south of France like you as a gap year before I went to uni, and then this is like way back when in my 20s, like decades ago. And then then the second time I had a third year as part of my degree living in Paris for the year. I just look back on that though. I was in my 20s, you can't drive, and it was a kind of a working type placement. So I'm not sure I saw everything, but got to know some wonderful people, and yeah, it's a great experience living it from the inside, like you say, rather than as a tourist. So
Yeah,
amazing.
it was.
Cool. Yeah, let's jump straight in, shall we? So your book, do you want to just sort of introduce yourself a little bit in connection to the book, and kind of give our listeners a kind of flavor of who you are, and kind of what the book's about, and kind of why now, and kind of what's happening with this book.
Yeah. Well, I know you do the YouTube thing, right? So this video is going to be posted. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the book for everyone who sort of wants to see it. So essentially, the beginning of my story is not an uncommon one. I came to faith as an evangelical. Before that, I shouldn't say came to faith, because I really engaged God quite a bit as a young girl growing up in a Catholic family. I'm from Long Island, New York. I grew up in a very Italian-American Catholic family, made all the sacraments, very involved in our parish on Sundays, all of that. And I remember, and I talk a little bit about this in the first chapter of the book, because the book is, very theological and philosophical. And I wrote it to have those ideas be accessible, at a pop culture level. I thought that was really important. But the first chapter is a lot about my life and quite autobiographical, so people sort of understand where I'm coming from as I write some of this stuff. But essentially, I would walk into these Catholic churches, cathedrals, parish, whatever, and I would just be so curious about what was in there, and I had a deep sense that something was living in here. There's something big and maybe holy and just huge and bigger than life and larger than life. I just couldn't quite figure it out. And people would say it was God, and I had these very sensory experiences. I would hear the hymnals kind of being put down on the pews, and I would hear the close of the confessional door as someone went in to confess their sins, and I would hear the clanging of the incense as it was being swung back and forth. And, I remember the echo of the priest singing the liturgy, and it was just all so mesmerizing. And, then when I was about 12 or 13, my mom moved my sister and I to a very large evangelical and charismatic church. And, then all of a sudden, all of this curiosity and all these questions I had was, it was all answered with the name of Jesus, and for me at that point. And that started, several years of my youth and young adult and teenage years being very much anything you would expect from evangelical youth culture. So obviously Jesus living in my heart, and purity culture, and true love waits, and missions trips. And I went to a public high school, and I petitioned the school board to have a Bible college, a Bible club. And, I taught Bible every week in my public high school. I was such an evangelist, and, Bible reading and devotional reading every day, and lots of volunteer and ministry work. And, then I gradually obviously moved on from high school. I went to university at a Bible college in the Midwest. It was Assemblies of God. So there I was fully immersed in like a Pentecostal holiness tradition. And that was my faith expression for many years. And, still tons of ministry, every extracurricular thing you could sort of think about. And I was very much the Jesus and me story, and God had a will for my life, and I was going to follow that at all costs, and everything you imagine an evangelical to be. And most people don't have to imagine what evangelicalism is like, because it's pretty front and center these days. But, I eventually went on to seminary after that, and was, rethinking some of aspects of my faith tradition. And I found myself leaving the Pentecostal and charismatic expressions behind. Then I found myself very progressive evangelical, really focusing on, social justice and being an ally to the queer community, and, all reproductive rights and all of these things that, evangelicals don't normally consider. I started to. And then very quickly I found myself post-evangelical. And then years on from that, I kind of gave my age away in the beginning when I said I celebrated my 40th at the beginning of the month. But, eventually found myself post-Christian, but still engaging Christianity. And this is what the book is all about. Not so much my story, even though my story is woven throughout the pages here and there, but it's really, what does it look like to engage Christianity, to engage faith, really, after we're past traditional notions of a lot of this stuff, and how it's showed up and expressed itself, in history and in society. So that's, a snippet about me, but there are a lot of details about that in the book if people are interested.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I guess like I can tune into some of those things, a different journey, I suppose, but that kind of I know that evangelical culture that you're talking about, I guess, is a bit different in America than it probably was here. I grew up in a Baptist church, sent from about the age of 5. Always like you, I read that bit in the book where early on you were like, but I've got questions, and they're just giving me these pat answers, and it was that that kind of just always having questions. I've just always been annoyingly philosophical.
Yeah.
I remember in France, actually, in that gap year at the end, one of the people working there just said, "Rob, ne philosophe trop." I think she wrote it in the book at the end, but it was just, I know exactly what you mean, that sort of culture of, well, maybe we'll come back to that in a bit, but that kind of, there's a sort of evangelical package, isn't there, that you, I know, we can be unfair to it, I suppose. There are all sorts of varieties within it, but there is a certain kind of package that you take the whole box, or you don't take it all, kind of thing.
Yeah. There's very much a stereotype. And, through the years, I've done my best to give the benefit of the doubt, because I've been on the inside, for a lot of years. It's been a lot of years since I've been on the inside, but I still have friends and family very much active in that tradition. And so I always do my best to give the benefit of the doubt, but that doesn't always work out in my favor. So, but yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I wonder if we could start with there was an image right at the beginning of the book that set me sort of thinking. I was just almost picturing you, actually, and it almost threw me back as well to a moment in history. So one of my favorite films, in fact really inspired me when I was about sort of 15, I'd imagine, maybe a little bit, 15, 16. I was just getting to that point where I'd grown up with my sort of evangelical culture, but then I remember writing these really angry poems, like I think one was called "The Bible Belt." It lashes you with its, just, I don't know, it's just this
I love
teenage, yeah, sort of teenage anger, like,
Sure.
but it was that full era of like Reagan and Thatcher and
Oh,
kind of
yeah. Yeah.
just growing up in that suburban, middle of the road evangelical church, and I just was kind of rebelling against it, I guess. And then I came across this film, you may well know, Brother Sun Sister Moon.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, Francis of Assisi. It's very,
Yeah.
it's a very kind of like 1960s hippie version of the story of St. Francis, but
Yeah.
I just remember just feeling really inspired by that and kind of like, oh, I want to give up all my wealth, I want to kind of, that radical thing. But the thing, I digress, but the thing that really put me into that film in your book was there's that bit there, I'll quote it from you. So you say, there's something about Christian architecture,
Mm.
sacred architecture, that speaks to the interior architecture of my own longing, a longing lying in rubble like the ruins at Aragonese. And I also have a firm dream and deep conviction that we need rubble and ruin to have any basis for the present and the future. And I was
Mm.
just thinking that scene in that film where Francis is he's given up all his wealth, and he's standing
Mm.
in rags, and he's in the ruined church of San Damiano,
Mm.
and he hears the voice of Christ saying, "Francis, rebuild my church."
Mm.
And I just pictured you there as I was reading that almost, and I was thinking, like, I guess that three questions come up for me
Mhm.
around that. Is like, first one, I'll do one at a time because I'm just chucking loads at you here. But
No, it's good. I'm with you. I'm
okay,
tracking.
cool. How much? The first one is like, yeah, how much deconstruction do you think is necessary for reconstruction? If reconstruction is, there's a premise in my question, but if reconstruction is something
Yeah.
we want to do.
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh. So to go back to an earlier question and then to answer the present one, why did I essentially write this book? Part of that is because this term deconstruction has been such a buzzword as of late. And for
Yeah.
good reason. Social media has really allowed community to just expand and travel at the speed of light around the world. And so, people are banding together in struggles that they have, struggles with religion, struggles with certainty, struggles with different brands of Christianity in society, and how it expresses itself. And so essentially you have a whole generation of people trying to disentangle and dismantle from really toxic forms of Christianity. Mostly it's conservative and fundamentalist and evangelical Christianity. And so they're all going by this term deconstruction. And, as someone who has a background in continental philosophy and philosophical hermeneutics, and who has, done a thing or two with the actual philosophical term deconstruction, I was very, very curious how this philosophical term made it to sort of this pop culture movement. And it's really disconnected, to then no one's really pulling from the work of Martin Heidegger or Jacques Derrida, Mark Taylor, or Karl Raschke, or John Caputo, who are the philosophers and scholars and theologians who are using deconstruction in a philosophical and theological way. But I was sitting back and I was listening to this conversation on deconstruction, and then subsequently what it looked like as people were reconstructing in the rubble. And at this stage in my life, and I don't know if you would agree, for me this comes with a little bit of age and experience. I probably wouldn't have had this reaction in my 20s, and probably not even in my early 30s, but at this stage in my life, when I hear a lot of roars, and a lot of reaction, I tend to just sit back and listen.
Mm.
I used to be
Yeah,
right in there, right?
yeah.
And now I just sit back and I listen, and I want to hear all the sides. I want to hear people's concerns. I want to, figure out where my empathies and my sympathies lie. And I just want to sort of observe and
Mhm.
watch sort of what's happening, and sort of take it all in to be able to maybe have some perspective and some commentary on it all. And, you know, I say this in the book, when holes started to poke in our faith, maybe in the 90s or the early 2000s, or, this term deconstruction is, as it's being used in pop culture today, is really only a couple years old.
Mm.
Back in our day, if I can say our day, I think there's a little bit of an age gap between us, but not a huge
Yeah.
one. um, you know,
51 this year, literally this week. So yeah,
what was
not got
that?
any. 51 this week. So
Happy
yeah,
birthday. Happy
thank you.
birthday.
Yeah.
So I think you're a Gen X guy, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I'm officially an elder millennial, so we're fairly close.
Yeah.
But in our day, it would have been you're backsliding. or you're losing your faith or something like that. And now people have been able to pick up on shared language to communicate their struggle to themselves, to the world, to each other. And I think that's great. But what I wanted to do is offer up partly offer up what actual deconstruction really is, and ask people to take the wager. Are we brave enough for actual and true deconstruction? Because what true deconstruction calls us to, which is essentially, it's something that's innate in everything, that is sort of a spontaneous combustion really at any time. And it can, break apart all of our structures that we've held so much trust in. And sometimes when we loosen a structure like Christianity and, the traditional idea of the God of the Bible and doctrine, and there's a long list, all the things that people say that they're deconstructing from, what we're finding is there is a reconstruction happening quite quickly, and it's just an image of a new kind of nicer God.
Right.
Maybe their theologies are a little bit more generous, and maybe God is playing for the nicer team, or maybe they're not even calling it God. Maybe we've expanded the language to the universe or to love, but it's still sort of this external force that's looking out for us, and that we're essentially transactional with. And so I'm inviting people into a deconstruction journey that has very little guarantee and certainly no promise of reconstruction, and that the journey itself is the point. The questing itself is theological, irrespective of sort of where you wind up and what you may build or not build. And if you are to build anything at all, it's certainly not going to come in the wake of the deconstruction and the ruins and the rubble. And that's not just my commentary. It's also biblical, this idea of sitting in your sort of sackcloth and ashes and grieving for, a proper time. So this isn't a judgment or an indictment on anyone who deconstructs and then reconstructs right away. This is simply my opinion and my commentary as someone who has lived to tell, I suppose. So I don't know really, I guess, if I can even answer that question, but those are some of my thoughts on those terms.
Yeah. And obviously my day job, except when I'm on annual leave, like I am now, is as a psychotherapist. So it's interesting that parallel, I guess, in terms of what people do in their lives when they come to therapy, very often it is that the image of people often use as a kind of a ball of wool, everything kind of knotted and confused, and don't know where to start, and it's kind of, they can't begin knitting something new really until they can start to unravel all the knots and work out, and then they might want to do something different to what they thought they were going to do at the end once it's all unraveled than when they went into the unraveling process, I suppose. Yeah. It sounds like what you're saying, maybe. Is that right? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think partly, and I think everybody's journey is different, and it doesn't have to look like mine or anybody else's really. For me, I think when you come out of certain traditions of Christianity where there is just so much pressure to know everything that there is to know. I mean, there's definitely an admission of like, we can't know everything. And, people love to use Bible verses, like we see through a glass darkly, dimly lit, and, all of these things. But yet there is also this recognition of there is stuff to know, and the stuff that's out there to know, we do know. We know it all. Anything that there is to know, we know. And the stuff that we're not supposed to know, fine. And there's just so much pressure to, there's this sense of Christian exceptionalism, really. And I think when things started to, unravel a bit for me, it wasn't so much sort of this grief-laden sadness and loss. It was more of like, and I talk about this in the book, it had been a slow melt for a long time. And the slow melt wasn't disconnected at all. I kind of gave a brief rundown of my faith history and my faith transition. Again, maybe today someone would call that deconstructing. For me, they were just faith transitions. I followed my curiosity from the time I was a young girl, being very curious, walking into a Catholic church, all the way up into sort of where I am now. It hasn't been this disjointed, unhinged thing. It's really kind of been, woven together, where one sort of curiosity when it came to faith and God and what this all looks like and means, to another. And, there was a time where there was a big break for me from the machine of evangelicalism and, American Christianity. And at that point, I really wasn't sure what to do with myself, and I didn't know which way to go, but I knew one thing, and the one thing I knew was I wasn't interested in atheism.
Right.
I also wasn't interested in where I had come from, but I knew the next step for me was not atheism. I didn't know what the next step was, and so in my book, I kind of called it coasting. I just coasted for a while, theologically, and for the first time, I didn't feel the pressure to have all the answers to be this great leader. You know, the pressure inside, Christianity and evangelicalism. There's a call on your life, and you're being ordained and divinely anointed and appointed to do something amazing in this world, and you've got to figure out what God's will is, and you've got to do it. And so it was the first time in my life where I had just said, you know what, forget it. Like, I'm laying this all down. I'm going to remove all of this pressure from my life, and I'm just going to coast, and I'm just going to figure some things out. um
Mm.
and it was years. I coasted for probably 2 or 3 years. But in that coasting, I also did things that gave me life. That was the time where I went and I lived in south of France, and I garnered a couple of master's degrees, and I got into a doctorate, and I found meaningful work. I traveled a lot. Made new friends. Like, I decided that I was going to sort of enrich my life in other ways. And once I was sort of built up again from, the
Mm.
blows of what it's like to leave certain forms of Christianity behind, I had enough strength to kind of go back to the drawing board theologically and continue to find my curiosities. And that's when I moved into the space that I'm calling post-Christian, and is essentially the basis, of the book that I've written. So
Yeah, it's good, in the sense that not reacting, that kind of just being able to park things to some degree. And
mm,
sort of, I kind of recognise that when I got divorced, I'm remarried now, but when I got divorced back in actually I was 40. I think it's probably something about being 40. um, at that time, it's it's a difficult experience because you feel a lot of, you know, guilt. I had friends that didn't, well, it looked like they didn't bother with me anymore. Um, that it was, where do you fit in now? And then there's an instinct in you to kind of like go, oh, well, I'm just going to rebel against it, then back to my teenage self, but in another way, And then I kind of remember just consciously deciding, no, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm just gonna park things. Just gonna not worry, not worry about it, almost not bother about it for a while.
yeah.
Um, I don't know if that's what you meant. Sounds sort of similar.
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of like, I can't really bother with this right now. There's a I just this is not what I need in my life right now. And I knew once I was ready to re-engage, I would, if I was ever. I just did not want to check any more doctrinal boxes, and that included atheism and agnosticism. I just didn't want to do that. And you know, at that time in my life, the entire tenure of my career has been in theological education, whether I've been a professor or an administrator. Um, I've worked in denominational leadership. I've done a lot of stuff by way of, faith and vocation. And at that point, I was working full time in a seminary, and I was high up in administration. I was working very hard. And I was doing really good work, and I was traveling a lot, and I was in theological stuff every day. So the last thing I wanted to do was sort of go to church on Sundays, because I felt like I had,
Mm.
you know, I hate to say spiritual community, because it wasn't. It was really like theological and philosophical. For me, that was more
Yeah.
fulfilling than a Sunday morning thing. So I didn't really miss not going to church, because I was always in like Christendom somehow. So because of my work. And so maybe that's where like my story is maybe different from some others. But I think that is what was really helpful too, is that somehow I was still tethered.
Mm.
And that is kind of like, for me, it's a metaphor for a bigger reality. And that is what, for me at least, post Christianity is all about. It's still being tethered to the story that has held us our whole life, but after we've moved past traditional notions of the story, now we're asking, okay, well, how does it hold us still, if it even
Mm.
does?
Yeah.
So, and it doesn't always. I do, what I call theological coaching, which is help people work out what they think and what they believe about some of this stuff, and, help them articulate it a little bit better, because I think finding new language for some of this stuff is really important, and part of the healing process, and part of what it means to move forward. And sometimes I get people who just want to be atheists and just need to work through some of the stuff that still scares them and haunts them about Christianity. And I always ask, okay, so just so I'm clear, like, there's nothing compelling you about the New Testament. There's nothing compelling you about the story of Jesus. There's nothing compelling you about, the fact that most of your life you've been steeped and you've in the story and you've identified with it. And if the answer is no, it's like, okay, well, let's dismantle some of this stuff for you so that you can go on and live your best life, and that one that does not involve faith, and that's okay. So it's not so much me being an evangelist for a new way of engaging Christianity, but for me doing this kind of work for the last decade or so, seeing how many people have moved past traditional Christianity and don't want to be atheists or agnostic, but they have no idea how to engage something that's either not traditional theism or militant atheism, and they feel like those are the only two choices. So they either re-entrench back in something that theologically and ecclesially forces them to compromise their intellect and their sense of reason and their intuition and their imaginations, or they move forward into something that essentially kills their soul, which is, belief in absolutely nothing, which isn't always what they want. And there's just this massive identity crisis that ensues. And I just think that we can do better.
Yeah. No, I was literally just thinking a minute ago when you started talking about that section, if you like, about the how unraveling it can be for people to, if you take away the, because if your faith has been central to who you are and how you see, not just who you are, but how you see the world, how you see others and everything, and that you put a kind of depth charge underneath that at a certain point in life, that's really disorientating for people. And it's interesting with one of my best friends is an atheist, he's a blogger and philosopher. He does a lot of stuff on YouTube and interviews a lot of people that are deconverted.
Yeah.
And one of the common things that's striking, really, is a lot of them are Americans as well, and ex-evangelicals, is that kind of response to, it's almost like they I don't know if this is unfair to them or not, but it almost, I get the sense that they need to be atheist. They need to have a strong, what's the word? When you have an injection, like inoculation, I need a strong dose in the opposite direction in order to be able to deal with all of the baggage and the hurt that came from that. Particularly a lot of stuff around teachings around hell and sort of eternal conscious torment, things that comes up a lot. And I mean, personally, I think that's kind of deeply at the heart of a lot of this, actually. And
Absolutely.
but yeah, they just seem to, I think for a lot of people, it's like, well, I just need to draw a line in the sand in that way. If I can kind of debunk the whole thing, kind of just push it away completely opposite, become anti-theist more than atheist very often, then that's a kind of way of resolving things for some people, I suppose.
Yeah. And I mean, again, people are welcome to think and believe, and interpret the world any way they like. But for me, atheism is just another form of re-entrenchment in a certain type of belief about a certain type of God, because essentially we're arguing about the existence of God. God exists or God doesn't exist, right? Theism or atheism. And, going back to post-Christianity and the basis of the book, when we move post-Christian or post-theist or post-God, again, these constructs of a metaphysical, supernatural, interventionist God who lives in the sky, and is a being and has personhood and engages us and has agency and all of these things, we do have to decide whether or not something like this exists or not. It asks us, it forces us to make that choice. And when we pass that, and when we kind of bypass that continuum, that for me, it's just like this ping pong match back and forth between the two sides, theism and atheism. No one's ever going to win. But when we go post that to what's beyond it, and things like existence and agency and object and being become totally irrelevant, when it becomes more of, it's more about a theological reality than it is an empirical one, or, a historical one, or a scientific, those sorts of things. When we're looking for a theological reality and narrative and story that can actually transform our lives and mean something for ourselves, the communities we're a part of, that sort of thing, then that all gives the sky god, a run for its money, truly, and in turn gives atheism a run for its money, because it renders atheism completely obsolete, and irrelevant. And in the book, I do quite a bit of criticizing and indicting on atheism, but it's mostly new atheism, Richard Dawkins and the Anti-God Squad and all of that. They're just as militant as Christians and as theists, which I find problematic.
Yeah, I was saying to my friend the other day, actually, you think about a lot of atheism, a lot of the atheists that he has on, it's a particular kind of atheism, isn't it? It's a kind of, it's an anti-reaction to the other things. So it's formed in the image, if you like, of a particular evangelicalism.
Indeed. That's it.
I often find that you end up with these kind of straw man arguments backwards and forwards as well, because it's, I mean, you go beyond that a bit, because you kind of then you're kind of trying to get beyond even sort of liberal Christianity, etc. But often you get this kind of just set two going on between, a version of Christianity that that's the only one that they know of, as critiquing from the outside, as if, we've had 2,000 years of, like, I don't know, great theologians, like Maximus the Confessor and Pseudo Dionysius, and there's just no knowledge of any of that whatsoever. It's just reacting to kind of very modernist 20th century fundamentalism, and it's kind of sad in a way, really. But but it's sad because the Christianity that's dominant is that very ahistorical, in my view, very kind of narrow, kind of just, that doesn't know much of its roots and history in a sense. But
absolutely.
Okay, well, I'm just going to look at my other questions, because but that was a wonderful.
It's easy to do.
No, but it's a really good. I was going to say detour, but it's a really good detour. I'll just see if they're relevant still, really. But we may have moved on.
Sorry, I'm not sure that I actually answered your question either about the ruins and the reconstruction. I'm not sure if I did that, because maybe I went off on a rabbit trail.
No, the going off on one is really good, because that's we were talking right at the beginning before we spoke, weren't we, about what's going to emerge rather than being too structured. But I mean, my third question might still be relevant, I suppose. When we think of ruins and rebuilding or what have you, the common metaphor biblically is of building on the rock, isn't it? Or so rather than building on sand, building on a rock, or having Christ as the cornerstone. People often in modern day probably think of a cornerstone as like it's down on the corner, but it was that that was on the top of the arch that if you removed it, everything kind of fell apart. So I suppose the question to ask is, let me get it right. Let me read it properly. So the question was, is postmodern theology more rock or sand?
You'll have to ask
a nice, clear question for you to react to.
Well, I was going to say, you'll have to ask a postmodern theologian.
Okay.
I don't claim to be postmodern at all. I mean, I have postmodern sensibilities about me and the work that I do. But in terms of being post-meta narrative and post-narrative, I'm not, quite squarely there, if one can be squarely there. But in terms of the rock and sand question, because I won't be so cheeky and just leave you there with, well, ask a postmodern theologian. In terms of your question about the rock and sand, these metaphors are meant to sort of serve us and not the other way around. With something like a cornerstone or sand, the point is that there's still nothing beyond it, right? So we still need to build on top of it. And I think when I talk about the ruins and, the part that you're mentioning in the book, I was coming to the end of my time in south of France, and I had gone on a holiday with friends to Ischia, which is a little island off the coast of Napoli. And there's this place called Aragonese, and it's this old medieval little village. It's a tiny island connected to the tiny island. And at the top was a cathedral that had been built in the 12th century. There we go. 12th century. That had been torn down in the 19th century. And I was walking along and I just had this realization that I was standing in cathedral ruins. And it was just this really visceral, like palatable moment of, um, in order to rebuild anything, we have to sort of be standing in nothing. And I had recently started reading a book by Franco Berardi, who is an Italian philosopher who kind of got his start in the Italian workers' movement of the late 70s. And he's still publishing, and he's prolific and brilliant. And I'm a big fan, and people should read him. But I think this book was maybe sometime in maybe 2007, 8, 9, something like that. It's called After the Future. And he talks about how capitalism, and then subsequently digital capitalism, has completely blown up our future. All the sort of industrial promises of the 20th century of, unfettered growth fetishes had completely fallen apart, and they've blown up our future. Now we don't have one. And these promises still just did not deliver. And I thought to myself, and he's saying, he's painting this really grim picture of like any structure that we had, any promise of the future based on the investment of these structures that have essentially stolen our future. They've all crumbled, and we have nothing to show for these these promises of grandeur. But he said this is precisely why our future is filled with so much hope, because it's been completely blown up by unsustainable growth models, with greed at the heart of it. And now we can actually build a proper creative future fueled with human ingenuity and creativity and imagination. And I thought, well, that's really the church, isn't it? In particular, I'm an American writer, an American theologian, particularly the American church. All you have to do is look at a couple of studies, a couple of pieces of data to see how fast the American church is declining. And I'm definitely not saying, hey, let's stop that decline and let's fix the future and let's figure it out. But what we're seeing is, sort of a death of what has been. And potentially we could have a composting. Do you know what I mean? When it lies in ruins, and when it has nothing to show for this future that it promised us, maybe then we can sort of do something with that. And so whether that's sand or part of a cornerstone that was left, of course, figuratively speaking, because again, there's a reason why we're post-Christianity. There's a reason why we're post-theist and not atheist, because we're still engaging what once was and what did hold us. We're just asking, well, how does it hold us now? And how does it continue to transform us? And what does this story look like moving into the 21st century? What is faith? What does God look like moving into the 21st century? And again, going back to that postmodern piece, living in a postmodern era, whether we want to identify as postmoderns or not, we are surrounded with an ethos that tells us things only matter if we can actually see what it looks like walking around in the world, and how it can actually aid in human flourishing in ways that actually deliver and matter, in ways that don't promise some external alternate far off reality, or a God who lives in the sky, or a world after this one that we're investing in now because we believe that there's another one to come. But what does it look like to have a sustainable and viable existence where we're not just surviving, but we're thriving? And faith actually matters. If we have a faith like that, then it's worth continuing on. Do you know what I mean? And it's worth moving past something that once was to be post, so that the new can come. So I guess, and in 100 years from now, people will have to do it all again, or maybe less. I don't know, because the rate at which change is occurring in our society, is more rapid than it's ever been. So whether it's sand or a stone, or whether you're keeping a little bit of your former tradition, that's left to the community that is asking to be transformed by it, and how much of that need, I guess. But
and I was wondering, just I think it kind of connects into what you're saying, or it did for me as you were speaking, was there's that bit in John's Gospel where John has Jesus say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I was wondering whether, is there a sense in which people, or the church has got fixated with Jesus as truth, but not necessarily like perhaps in the bigger sense of what that might mean, but
Yeah.
propositional truth.
Mhm.
What's been lacking is like the way or the life. There's this, like, so if you go to like Buddhism, I
Yeah.
don't know, or you go to other kind of, or some of the ancient philosophies, which they were never kind of in the abstract. They were always schools of ways of life, like Stoicism and so on.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's part of this deconstruction move is just a tiredness with something that's so a big thing that I do within my therapy work is something called acceptance and commitment therapy. So
Mm.
ACT. And one of the things we talk about in there is whether something is workable.
Mm.
Is this livable? Is this taking you in a direction that your values, what you really value?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if there's something about maybe even modernity to some extent, but also that kind of modern Christianity that's overly focused on this kind of propositional aspect of God and Jesus and so on, and people are just hungry for
Mm.
being alive. That's a way of life that has a discipline, that has, if I follow this in a certain way, I can actually grow as a person, rather than it being kind of, well, these are the check boxes you've got to tick, and in terms of what you think and you're kind of a fully subscribed member of the evangelical party. Does that
Yeah.
make sense? Does that ring resonate or not?
Yeah, it totally resonates 100%. I mean, I think what religious people don't always realize or understand is that, uh, and I hate to use us and them language, but I have to in this situation,
Mm,
they're so used to assuming that their truth is absolute and universal and untouched by time and history and, context and social
mm,
landscapes and, cultural affairs and all of these things. And that's just simply not true.
mm,
That's just not how it works. But they like to believe that what they believe is outside of anything that can touch it and exists on a plane all by itself. And you brought up the word modernity, and uh, that is that's a really good point, because essentially this addiction to knowledge and this addiction to a certain type of truth that can be proved, through a particular formula, 2 + 2 = 4, and this is why type of thing. We're going to check that box and believe that's true. Is because essentially, the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason sort of forced people to prove their
mm,
truth. Moving out of kind of the romantic period of a pre-modern period, really, of just believing something because you believe it and you have faith that it exists even if you can't see it. Along come the Enlightenment philosophers and say, no, if you want to say this is truth, then it's either fact or it's fiction. And if you're
mm,
telling me you believe it just because you believe it and you have no evidential proof, well, guess what? Then this is definitely fiction. And so it really forced Christians, and this is where, apologetics really started to come to the fore, at least a certain type of apologetics, to be able to defend and prove your faith and why it exists. And so I think that is kind of what started the last, 250 years of, what we've come to know as fundamental Christianity. And it's a real shame, because that sort of propositional truth and having to prove that, it really takes all the beauty out of
mm,
a meaning making mechanism such as religion and such as Christianity, and
mm,
what all of that has to offer us and what we can offer it.
mm,
People think certain doctrines of hell or afterlife, or even eschatology and rapture debates and that kind of thing. Like, these things, they're only like 200 to 250 years old. People just take for granted that they've been around forever, and that it's like, Bible truth from the first and second centuries, or maybe at the very least the church councils, of the fourth century. But it's all relatively young, and it's a byproduct of what has been happening in the times in which those particular believers were living in. Um, so, yeah, in terms of truth, people read a line like that out of the Gospels, and they see truth with like a capital T, but maybe they do sometimes disregard the way and the life piece.
yeah.
I've actually, that particular Bible verse has been presented to me quite a bit, by arguing evangelicals who don't like the work I do, and say, well, what do you make of this and what do you make of that? and it's just so clear that the interpretation is just so narrow. It's what their pastor told them, or what they read in a book, or how their particular faith tradition has interpreted that for a very short amount of time.
It's,
So yeah.
It's just that sort of lack of richness of very often, isn't it? And it's I was thinking of lost my train slightly, but what was I was going to say? It'll come back to me maybe. Oh, that was it. Yeah, I don't know if you've heard of Ian McGilchrist. He's a British. He's worth looking up if you haven't. He's
Okay.
British psychiatrist, had done a lot of work on brain lateralization.
Okay.
I won't go into any detail and bore you, but one of the things that's interesting that he points out is this turn. So he talks about how we live in an age when the left hemisphere is becoming overly dominant, but it's it says like if you were to knock out one of your hemispheres, the hemisphere you'd probably want to choose would be to keep your right hemisphere intact, because it sees the whole picture. It's a bigger, it's a more holistic, whereas the left hemisphere is much more focused on kind of manipulating the world and abstractions, and it gives a kind of very kind of narrow and partial picture. But one of the things he talks about is what you were talking about there a minute ago, which is this kind of what he calls a kind of the abstract reasoning. So people have moved away since the Enlightenment from this ability to see reason as something that's much more informed also by imagination, that you can have reasoned imagination, to this kind of reductionist, it's not the right word, this almost sort of mechanical, logical type approach, which I sometimes wonder. I listen to these debates between atheists and theists, and I'm thinking, is this person a little bit left hemisphere dominant? They just haven't got, is this a paucity of imagination almost? This is maybe a bit unfair, but I think that the blame for that probably lies within a certain type of Christianity, like you said, that has fallen prey to that very same thing of, losing the richness of the kind of more imaginative, speculative reasoning, which doesn't have to pin everything down.
Yeah. Very much so. I mean, I think it's really tough because people desperately want to believe in something that is bigger and better than themselves. They desperately want to believe in other worlds where things are set to rights and it's better than the one that we live in, and that there is meaning behind all the suffering, that we can sometimes experience. And I actually just published an article. I have a blog on Patheos, and I haven't been very active on it the last several months because I've been writing the book, and I have so many other publishing commitments. But I was like, I've got to start writing on Patheos again. And I actually just published yesterday an article that is actually now trending on the Asbury Revival. And again, I published it after the fact because it was just so vitriolic when it was happening. You had conservatives on one side saying, oh, like God is moving, and, these things are happening, and this is what we need, and this is what happens when you pray for revival and praise God and type. And then you had like the liberal end of Christianity, which is like, this is a bunch of BS, and show me the fruit. And this is just like a really big, long worship service where people are just wanting to like sit and like pacify themselves. It was just really vitriolic. And again, I wanted to just sit back and kind of observe and take it all in. And my article was really about, this is not, again, I'm writing from a post-Christian perspective. So for me, the question is not, is God moving? Has God showed up? Does this bear the mark of divine presence, or does it not? Right? Because that's what those debates were about. For me, that's neither here nor there. That is just not even like part of the conversation. For me, I look at a movement like Asbury and I say to myself, what is the depth? What is like the deep-seated human need that is present here that would create such an experience? Like, society has, like, at this, I'm an optimist, always have been. I'm a glass half full kind of a girl, always have been. But at present, anywhere you look in the world, like, society is failing people. Governments, regimes, legislation, the economy, like, people are just being failed left and right. And so desperately, I'm sure young people more than most want a reprieve. They want an eye in the storm. They want to just go where they can find some sense of peace and commune with something that they feel is giving them that peace. So, of course, something like the Asbury Revival. I'm surprised we don't see things like this pop up all the time, because people want an environment like that where they can just be held by something that they believe is really beautiful and has their best interest at heart, where there seems to be an overlapping of perfect community and perfect unity and perfect oneness, whether it's the oneness they're experiencing with each other, or the oneness that they feel like they're experiencing with their God, or whatever. Like, this is what people want, and this is ultimately what people want from religion, and this sort of meaning making, narrative. And so in that sense, I have a lot of compassion. I'm not, again, I think there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of bitterness, and sometimes that's for very good reason. There are a lot of people out there who have been very hurt by the church, and certainly by evangelicalism. I am among those factions. But there's just so much anger, and sometimes for good reason. Let's be honest, a lot of time for good reason. But if we don't move past that anger, to contexts and to theologies and to positions of our hearts and minds, that can actually move on and engage faith well, even past some of this stuff, then I don't really know what the future holds for faith and Christianity and for engagement with God. But I do know that I have a lot of time and a lot of compassion for people who are holding on to certain constructs of God and religion, because this is what they're after, to fulfill a need, because we've just always been taught that we're working at a deficit as a human. We're experiencing our human condition constantly. And, most of the time we're taught to believe that there's something outside of ourselves that can fill this sort of unquenchable, bottomless desire for wholeness and healing. And sometimes it's okay to just say, I'm human. I live with an ache. I live with a desire. Sometimes it's quenched, sometimes it's not. But again, it's back to that certainty piece of there's something out there, that can do this for me. So I don't know. That was definitely a little rabbit trail, but
No, it's good. I mean, I often I found myself, I think I said to you on the email, didn't I, that increasingly more these days kind of, I guess we're getting into metaphysics a little bit here now.
that's
Maybe
okay.
this could be our turn towards that. But there was a great article I read by Daniel Saw, a theologian from Cambridge, who talked about what's the word? Convergent thought between, say, Hindu Vedanta and some Augustine. Even he says Augustine even teeters on the edge of this at points, almost goes there. But you've got this kind of non-dual monist thinking where he talks about the I am of God, and then talks about the I am of ourselves. And I won't go off on any particular spiel from that, but it was just that for me, it's come, it's like Meister Eckhart, that kind of, the eye, the eye that sees me is the eye is the eye of God. That I love people like Rupert Spear as well. I'm increasingly coming to wonder whether this is this false dichotomy pushed by certain types of Christianity. It's almost dualistic, the separate God, the separate humans. Is what you describe. You end up with, rather than seeing ourselves as kind of rooted in the divine, as this kind of atomistic idea of humanity. So I am a entirely separate self, which it doesn't even fit within New Testament Christianity. If you look at St. Paul or whatever, to the as Luke has him in the book of Acts, at least, saying, in him we live, move, and have our being. It's almost pantheistic. It's like, well, there's not really a big separation point between the two. And if we do drive that wedge, then we do kind of set ourselves adrift. And create, which is not to say you're not still going to feel that finiteness. But I wonder if there's kind of room there within a new Christianity or a new theism that might emerge in dialogue with the East and so on as well. So that's kind of where my thinking's been going a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, those are really interesting questions. And I know a lot of people who are attracted to, Eastern forms of thought and religion and philosophy. And I think that there is a lot of good there as well.
Yeah.
Um, you know, as we're in the Lenten season right now, and last week was Ash Wednesday, and so I was doing some contemplating on, the time Jesus spent in the wilderness and those 40 days, and kind of where we get the Lenten season from. Really, is that, and I wrote a Patreon piece about it. I don't always feel the need to write really religious stuff on my Patreon, even though a lot of it is about, post-Christian thought. But when these high holy seasons come and these high holy days like, Christmas and Easter and Good Friday and Lent, I do feel compelled to kind of write some stuff about it, because I think people, after they, again, moving on from, traditional interpretations of this stuff, one of the biggest deficits people like that have are, what do we do with ritual? What do we do with something simple like prayer time or devotional time? Like maybe someone no longer wants to pray the way they once did. What do they do with that time that they felt centered and connected? And, so I think it's important to still have some thoughts on this stuff. And so I kind of just jumped into Jesus's time in the desert, in the wilderness. And I don't know why I've always been so attracted to this story. And I think it's because Jesus is actually engaging and dialoguing with, who the gospel writers call like the tempter. And I just think that that one-on-one dialogue is so interesting, and how they wrote it. But essentially, and I say this in air quotes, the devil tempts Jesus 3 times. And the first 2 times he tempts Jesus to be God. You say you're, the son of God. You say you have, this divine right and power. So if you are God, if you are the son of God, do these things. And then the final temptation is, okay, you don't want to be God for me. You don't want to put that power and prestige on show. Well, do this and join me, and I'll give you. I'll still make you a god. It'll just be a different kind. And so he's constantly tempting him to divest himself of his humanity and basically bail on his humanness and
Right.
put on his full divinity. And Jesus is like, no, no, no. Even though he could have claimed it, because it wasn't really a temptation, because ultimately, like, we find out that Jesus was a particular son of God. That takes some theological nuancing there, but we find out that Jesus is son of God in the Gospels. But for him, paramount to everything else was holding on to his humanity. And that is what his faith and his Jewishness asked of him in that moment. And he wasn't willing to sacrifice his humanity for any. There was no sacrificing happening there. So often we give up something during Lent, and we're taught to sacrifice, as Jesus kind of fasted away in the desert for those 40 days. But Jesus actually didn't sacrifice the one thing that was most honored and most valuable and most prized by him, and that was his sense of humanity. And so, I prefer to follow that lead. I'm not going to sacrifice my humanity for anything, not for a divine display, of power and influence and strength and might, not for anything sacred outside of myself that I may be tempted with, because it looks really sexy or special or bombastic, or it makes a big splash, or that kind of thing. I'm going to hold on to my humanity at all costs, because this is what matters. And, in the New Testament, if we see an imperative for anything, it's to be new creation and to make all things new. And so I'm totally happy to apply that to my humanity and to the humanity of others. And so, I think when we're talking about this kind of stuff, it's not about giving up faith or, even giving up engaging Jesus. In my book, I talk about why Jesus is actually still really important as someone who's post-Christian, how we can still engage Jesus. And there's another whole chapter on why the Christian and post-Christian. Why is it so important that I'm post-Christian and not just post-religion or post-belief or those kinds of things? So.
Absolutely, yeah. And kind of how you position yourself with regard to those narratives as well. And that, because I mean, for me, there's that whole, I'm reopening the whole question for me. There's the quest for historical Jesus, which I'm not expecting to find the answers. but just reading kind of, you know, Dale Allison and so on. And but I'm also mindful, there was something I read the other day. I think the thing that really strikes me in the day is like proving, disproving. It just doesn't get me anywhere. But no matter how much I try, I've got a cross, San Damiano cross in my kitchen, just on the corner. I quite like that, kind of put it somewhere practical where the business of life happens. You know? But it almost jars in me that sort of beauty of Christ in the Gospels. Do you know what I mean? That kind of, like I was saying to my atheist friend the other day, like, you know, if you took, like, Christianity seems to have gone wrong in some respects because it's like just all these propositions, and it's like theologies of how you get into heaven, or blah. It's just reduces it down to these kind of story headlines, you know.
Yeah.
But then if you took all the major teachers of the world, like, I don't know, Lao Tzu and, like, you know, the Buddha and what have you, and you were allowed to keep one thing from each of their teachings, you know, what is it that you would keep hold of from Jesus that you think, wow, this is, like, you know, this is the central thing? And to me, it would be like this idea of non-reciprocal love, that you love not only those that love you, but those that dislike you, as your Father gives, you know, sun and rain to the grateful and the ungrateful alike, you know. And yet, just if that's like, that seems like a massive distinctive, and it seems to be even a distinctive on Judaism. It's like, why bother with Christianity if you're not going to make that the centerpiece of? Because it seems to me that the key jewel in the crown, and it's the key thing that Jesus seems to talk about. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a lot of things that get sacrificed, you know, at the expense of some other things that are just more convenient, when it comes to certain people wanting to hold the status quo and power and affluence and things like this. So yeah.
Okay, I wondered. There's loads of more stuff I kind of want to ask you. I wondered. I'd love to get your thoughts. As I know you've just already told me, so you've kind of ruined this already, Maria. But
Sorry.
you've already told me you're not a postmodern theologian. But David Bentley Hart here talks about John Caputo a bit, and kind of, I think there are sort of postmodern roots in some of the post-Christian thinking that you bring.
Sure.
I don't know if you know David Bentley Hart. He's often quite dry and kind of.
I do, yeah.
I always end up having to grab a dictionary and look up about 5 words on the page I read of his. I read one of his books of the week or some of it, and I was like, I'm gonna have to read a summary because I'm not really sure I understand this.
I understand. I have those readers as well. Those not readers, those thinkers that I read as well. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I just thought this is a bit of a provocation, really. So I thought I'd just put it out there and see kind of how you react to it, really, a little bit.
Sure.
But yeah, essentially, I think he's trying to sort of say, let me find the right part here. So he seems to be challenging what he considers a disguised modernity within postmodernity and postmodern theology in theologians like Caputo, who doesn't write off, by the way. He just says this is the common tropes that you get in postmodern theology. But then he kind of essentially says that it's really impossible to do any engagement philosophically or theologically without an implicit metaphysics. And that postmodernity, in a sense, it has a kind of dissimulated metaphysics that it privileges to itself, that it's not honest about, is what he kind of says here. So I'll show the clip, and then there's a great little quote right at the end. That can be our springboard, but take it where you want, Maria. So, and I appreciate the fact that you said you're not really a postmodern theologian.
It's okay.
You're off the hook anyway.
I am a big fan of Caputo, and there's a lot of John Caputo's work in my book, and a lot of radical theology in there. So yeah, I interact with Caputo's work a ton, and has been probably one of maybe the top 2 or 3 thinkers that have formed kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. Okay, and part of what I read there just seemed to be really good. What he said, Caputo, like the weak theology rather than the strong theology, and it just seemed quite Christian to me. You know, like Christ that comes in weakness and not in power. But anyway,
Sure.
I'll show you the clip, and then it's about what's 2.5 minutes long, I think, something like that. And then yeah, we'll go from there.
I mean, at least in the Anglophone world in recent years, among those generally designated promoters of a postmodern theology, and I guess I would include Richard Carney and John Caputo as good specimens here, without trying to oversimplify their projects. The title has come to imply a kind of recognizable composite of some of the more easily assimilated themes provided by an earlier generation of continental thinkers, each of whom flourished sometime in the late 70s through the early 90s. Some Derridian post-structuralist principles embraced within a broad Leotardian claim to a suspicion of all meta-narratives, except, of course, the meta-narrative of this post-meta-narrative vantage on all meta-narratives. Wrapped in the brooding atmosphere of mystically oblique, almost masochistically disinterested Levinasian ethical seriousness, framed by a Vatimo-esque salvific narrative of divine kenosis as the redemptive exhaustion of the transcendent in the immanent, or of, in more discursive terms, every strong structure of being in the peacefulness of weak thought, the whole combination bedizened with touches of Foucaultian genealogy or Nancean stories of transcendental violence or Deleuze-Guattarian talk of original rupture or something like that. Generally, the guiding pretense is, and I'm sorry to sound, I'm getting a bit fatigued now. It's 15 years. Generally, the guiding pretense is of a theology that has shed the encumbrances of something called metaphysics and all its putative pathologies, the inherent violence of metaphysics, inherently violent essentialisms, hostility or insensibility towards alterity, and so forth. And what ideally should emerge from this confluence is a special piety or ethos, tolerant of difference, peaceful and patient, and unambitious and charitable. And one of its names can justly be secularity. Now, I have to, as may be obvious from the deadpan with which I delivered that, I guess, there's something less than tepid sympathy on my part for this discourse. To my mind, to begin with, the project of constructing a post-metaphysical theology is somewhat preposterous. I mean, I think of it as like post-atmospheric air.
Yeah. I got it.
Yeah, just put it out there as I don't know what you made of that. He's kind of typical sort of Hart style.
Yeah. I mean, I picked up every reference and, every kind of name drop and all of that. I've read all those guys and I see what he's saying. His last line of, a post-metaphysics theology is like breathing post atmospheric air. I don't agree with that at all. I mean, on one hand, he's criticizing scholars like Caputo and Carney and Derrida and Vatimo and Nancy and Deleuze and all the other scholars he named for sort of a different, engaging a different side of the same coin. And I think you said before you played, the weak God versus the strong God and that kind of thing. And that would be a proper criticism if these guys were engaging a metaphysical God, or even if they were more of a Zizek persuasion and they were, admitting to Christian atheism, but no one that he mentions does, I don't think. And they are past metaphysics. They're not opposite of metaphysics, because that would be atheism or Christian atheism or, non-materialism or whatever like fancy philosophical word. They have literally, to use a metaphysical word as a metaphor, transcended that conversation of metaphysics entirely. So, I think his language is getting a little confused because, at one point within his little soliloquy, he's talking about that group as if they're anti-metaphysics. And at the end, he says they're post-metaphysics. And the only reason why he thinks that you can't breathe post-atmospheric air is because post-atmospheric air is the absence of air. And we're not talking about the absence of God, if I could say we. We're talking about the absence of a metaphysical one. God, and what's happening in the name of God, and how God insists rather than exists, a la Caputo language, is what's on the table for discussion. And somehow he's not really picking up on that. And he that also sounds arrogant, because obviously this guy is as smart and as intelligent as the day is long. It was so funny how he said, "Oh, excuse me, I'm so fatigued as I'm just sort of rattling on all of this stuff."
Yeah.
And it would be fatiguing if you are trying to take everything that all of these thinkers are saying and fit it into a really neat category of metaphysics or anti-metaphysics.
Yeah, I think because the way I understood it, I don't know what. Maybe this is where it's important to kind of define metaphysics in a way, because this is part of the book as well, isn't it? So he, the way I understood that you sort of talk of metaphysics is kind of about whether there is a kind of supernatural big God in the sky kind of thing. I think what
we can even expand that to like life force and consciousness and energy. Like I'm we can actually make it metaphysical.
Yeah. Whereas I think Hart here is.
Yeah.
I think Hart here, and this is the way I sort of use metaphysics in the sort of traditional philosophical sense, would be more kind of like, God, the fact it's difficult to describe is, I think, part of the problem of what it actually is. It's almost this kind of, it's kind of asking the question not so much whether they're theist or atheist, as more whether they're moving, whether you can be post metaphysics, because he's kind of saying, in a sense, you've always got an ontology, you've always got a philosophy of what is, and you've always got a philosophy of how you know it. And so he's kind of saying, wherever, this is the way I read him anyway, wherever you position yourself, you're always doing a metaphysics, because you're always, because metaphysics being about those classical transcendentals are like, good, truth, and beauty, and being per se. So in a sense, you can't talk about anything without talking about being, or truth, or goodness, or, well, certainly not being, because you're kind of yeah. So that's kind of how I kind of understood that, is the post-atmospheric air thing, kind of like you all philosophy and all position taking, even if it's postmodern, has an underwritten metaphysics. But the one he goes on in his book on the beauty of the infinite, he talks about how I guess postmodern theology draws its roots largely from Nietzsche, and he's like saying how really what Nietzsche does is in the death of God, because you talk about the death of God theology quite a bit. He shifts the kind of the ontological primitive, if you like, or the ground of all being, from the Apollonian world of order to there being this fundamentally chaos, so that the reality is ultimately there is no being that grounds reality, it's all becoming. I think you see that in Heidegger and so on as well. And then I was going to quote this other one as well, but I won't. But Hart and John Milbank having a conversation, saying, well, the difficulty, and he's actually saying, a lot of postmodern theology is well intended in its direction, and often is kind of left leaning in its politics and so on, but the danger is that you're actually potentially, and maybe it wasn't an accident that Heidegger went this direction, the danger is that in placing a kind of chaos and power at the root, or Dionysius at the root and the foundations of metaphysics, you're laying the ground root for fascism, in a sense, that actually it's just will to power in Nietzsche. It's just all these centers of energy and becoming. But I'm chucking loads at you here. But
no, I'm tracking with you. It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that in a sense that when we're doing a theology or metaphysics of becoming, it presumes a being that is becoming. How do you have becoming without the what that is becoming?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about a theology of becoming, like that language is very much process language. That's process
Yeah,
theology.
yeah, yeah,
Whitehead and Keller and process,
yeah.
which is dealing with God as change and God as process and change itself. And for me, I've never been a process theology kind of person. I went right to radical theology when I was engaging, some non-traditional notions of theism and God, because for me, at the heart of process is still being. I always talk when I talk about process, which isn't often because I'm not super well versed in it. But for me, it's like the last stop on the train of ontology before the train just flies off the edge of the cliff and you're in radical theology.
Mhm.
That doesn't really deal so much with ontology at all. And so if he wants to talk about metaphysics and being and process and becoming, that's fine. But that's definitely not what I'm talking about. I don't think that's what Caputo and Carney or any of the people he mentioned are talking about. And that's certainly not what radical theology is about. Now, in terms of, um, you know, reauthoring some, very familiar Christian language that Caputo does do and likes to do, he'll reinterpret the kingdom of God as, anarchist.
Mm, mm,
And, he'll talk about, weak theology and the folly of God and these sorts of things. Like most things, radical theology is a spectrum. And so where you have a wonderful scholar, like John Caputo, who wants to sort of reauthor language that has been co-opted for way too long in really toxic ways, then you also have a radical theologian like Jeffrey Robbins, who thinks that we need new language entirely because the former language is weighed down with too much baggage. So where, one sees resurrection, Robbins might say something like insurrection. And when, one sees Messiah, Robbins might say metamorphosis, so
mhm.
yeah, there's a spectrum there too. But yeah, radical theology is essentially, after metaphysics. So I'm
Yeah,
I'm not sure. I mean, I'd have to Google to see if there's a conversation between Hart and Caputo. That would be an interesting
mm,
YouTube
yeah.
clip. Speaking of YouTube clips, but
Well, it is interesting because I mean, one of the things he goes on to say in that bit, I thought I won't bore you because he's like very verbose, but
that's okay.
very long. But he says like if I do interfaith dialogue, he says which is important to me quite a lot. Particularly with Asian religions, and the thing that we're doing when we're doing that particularly is kind of there's a kind of common ground, a common metaphysics of rationality, which we all can share in, so we can talk about what is similar and what's different, and that if we take out metaphysics, and I think this is metaphysics maybe slightly differently from how you mean it, but
Mhm.
metaphysics in the sense of not necessarily a totalizing grand narrative that controls everything, but that a kind of framework of thinking of how how we understand being, then we can't do those discussions anymore, basically saying. And the problem then he sort of says is that if we take a certain types of postmodern thinking, we might end up then in a position where we're actually redoing modernism and again, and we're kind of telling these other religions, well, you're all just as bad as each other, all these religions, and it's just kind of there's no narrative that we really need to listen to. We're the ones on sort of subtly on the top of the big meta narrative of
Yeah,
postmodernity. Kind of
yeah,
we can critique, we can nullify everything from our vantage point. I think that's kind of what he's roughly
yeah.
saying. But
Yeah, I mean, it's
yeah,
interesting because postmodernity is essentially like leaving room for each and every person's phenomenological experience with anything.
yeah,
I mean, to be like really simple and sort of rudimentary, I'm looking at my hand, I'm experiencing it as my hand, but someone else might experience my hand as my foot. I don't know. We, essentially like my experience with God, your experience with, it's all going to be so different because it's a phenomenon. And it's a phenomenon that happens once. And even though we might have a similar experience the next time around, it's still a phenomenological one because it's always going to be different. And so, when he talks about everything is metaphysics, and kind of relates it to postmodernity. Metaphysics is essentially, I say essentially like I'm such a expert on it. I'm not. I think essentially for me maybe is a filler word, so I should stop saying it so much. But at its simplest, I guess for me is the possibility of what we potentially can't expect or can't explain or maybe can't anticipate, and potentially some answers to questions that we have, even though we may never have the answer that lies deep within the metaphysical question. So I understand that in that sense, it's likening it to a phenomenological experience. What I'm trying to do with my work is bring some of these concepts, because essentially, is that word essentially? What we have done, you and I guess, for the past 20 minutes is have a conversation and have a clip played that if someone with zero theological or philosophical background were to hear or listen to, they would be completely tongue-tied in their brain and probably not be able to engage well because there's just no background. And so what I've always kind of strived to do, especially now, is build that bridge between ivory tower concepts and pop culture, so that some of the stuff can actually really make it out to where it's useful. So if I throw out something really radical, like how to engage God beyond the being of God, I might be here and someone else might be here. But if they hear a little bit of that and it inspires something in them, and it essentially acts as a whisper of a ghost that will haunt them to bring them a little bit this way, they may not be here right away or ever, but if they come a little bit out of their, polarizing end of the spectrum, maybe it might be transformative for them and whoever they might engage. So I'm happy to have the conversation about metaphysics and postmodernity and phenomenological experience and blah, blah, blah. But for me, it's how does this translate into everyday lives of people of faith who are having a real crisis of faith at the moment? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, got you. Yeah. Well, we'll draw things to an end soon, because I've realized, probably it's been a while now, and you probably don't want to tie you out too much. But
no, I'm always happy to talk and have conversations. I wonder if maybe our listeners, I don't know if we're getting.
Yeah, we'll begin to draw things together. I just wondered, and it's a question I kind of planned, but it also came to mind when you were saying about John Caputo, to give him a fairer crack of the whip now. But do you think there's an element whereby Christianity, within its DNA, it's inherently deconstructive? That it's almost like, you talked about one point in the book, didn't you, about Christ on the cross? The
end of meaning,
dereliction and forsakenness, and that it. Tom Holland, there's a great book called Dominion. I've not read it, so I'm going to try and sound more educated than I actually am. But in that book, he talks about the trajectory of the impact. He talks about the cross as being like a depth charge under Western history. So he says, like, this came about because he went to Syria and Iraq and saw Christians that had been crucified by ISIS jihadis. And he said, I was just absolutely shocked at the brutality. And he said, and then it struck me as a historian of ancient Rome and Greece, and he said, it just struck me, this crucifixion was a norm for the Romans. You went up to the Esquiline Hill outside Rome, 10 a penny, like slaves, if they were disobedient, they would just be crucified, left for carrion, And he said, it just struck me how much we assume history is Christian, and we don't realize how Christian we are. So, essentially that kind of, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. The cross of the powerful, I suppose this would be John Caputo, the Most High God taking the form of a slave, and this is where you meet God in weakness. So that, in a sense, put a depth charge under the ancient world's ideas of power. And we have that, it flows through all our politics, even our secular revolutions. He says, Marxism even has been inspired by this, speaking to power. But anyway, I've gone on a long diatribe.
No, but you make such a good point, because essentially, what you're saying is, a question that Jean-Luc Nancy has asked, and that is, the entirety of the West is built on Christianity. and the entire West experiences the nervation of Christianity. It would be like ripping out veins of my arm and asking me to continue on as a human. That's what it's like asking the West to continue on without Christianity. The structure, and as you say, or as maybe Holland says, the depth charge of the cross that undergirds the West, it just cannot be underestimated. It's massive. It's huge. And so, again, just going back to that question of like, all right, well, this thing holds us, but how does it hold us? Moving into the 21st century is going to be, an important question. Because, we talked a lot about atheism earlier. Like, atheism is a reaction to Christianity. My husband's an atheist, and it's amazing. Also, I was married earlier, like yourself. I talk a little bit about my divorce in the first chapter of the book. And my husband and I, we've been married for 2.5 years, and he's British, which is why we decided to live in England at the moment. And he is insanely supportive of my work and can talk about it in some ways better than me. But he is an atheist, and we like to joke about that a lot. But he'll often say, well, I'm not just an atheist of like the Christian God. Like I obviously don't believe in God like as a whole, like, and he'll kind of go through the various religions. And I say, yeah, I understand that. But you probably wouldn't be an atheist and like raise your hand and say, yeah, that's me. If it was just, if you were just trying to rage against, the Hindu gods or Buddhist gods or, that type of thing. Like your first and foremost and like primary reaction as an atheist is to, the Western idea of the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible and how we've appropriated those power structures in that particular interpretation of life and society. So all of life in the West for a very long time has been built on the Christian narrative, which is why it's so important that we continue to engage it. And that is why my work and my thought goes by the name post-Christian. Because Christian is still in there. For me, it has to be, really.
And that's, it's the other half of the coin of that point about Tom Holland as well, in the sense that holding on to that Christian part of your work, because he talks about how Christianity creates these revolutions, like the Reformation. But even now, like in your work, potentially, I don't want to put words in your mouth, and you can speak for yourself rather than me positioning you. But so okay. Feel free to fight your way out of that paper bag if you want. But it's is there something profoundly Christian in the work of what you're doing in terms of post-Christianity? That Christianity has this critique, this constant self-examination, this, I don't know, is that right?
Yeah, I would say yes, and I would say yes, and according to Derrida and deconstruction is innate in all things, not only in Christianity, but it's that combustive, blowing apart dynamite that is innate in everything, really. So certainly present in Christianity. Yeah.
Thanks, Maria. So before we finish, I just want to give you a chance to do any kind of shameless further plugs about the book, where people can find it, where people can find you, but also any kind of, I know you've got some projects in the pipeline as well for the future.
Yeah. So my book, Safer Than the Known Way, A Post-Christian Journey, out wherever you buy books, really. If you buy it from Amazon, would love a review. Really important to new authors like myself to have those ratings and reviews. But you can go to my website, mariafrancescafrench.com, and that's essentially anything I'm involved in, any project, courses, podcasts, other publications, Patreon, Patheos, anything, and a little bit about, what I think about things. It's all there in like a one little page situation. So yeah, and it's also obviously linked to the book. So mariafrancescafrench.com. And I have a follow-up book coming out hopefully in the next 2 or 3 months. I'm waiting for a concrete publishing date, but it's a reader to accompany this particular book, because I imagine that once people wrote this book, if they were interested and inspired by it, that they would want more of it. And so I've created a small reader. It's essentially a book of small essays on how to think new thoughts regarding some of this stuff. And part of it came out of the fact that, we talked a little bit ago about these gaping holes of ritual in our life. And so maybe we don't have devotional books anymore. We don't journal the way we used to. Well, I'd like to create something that people can read on a weekly basis that would inspire some new thoughts for them. And so that's what I've done. And I hope to have a new book out by the end of the year or the beginning of 2024. It depends on when this next book is published. And I have a title, but I'm not going to give it away just yet.
Oh.
You can be expecting a lot from me in the next year. We'll just say that.
Okay, we're not going to get there. You heard it here first moment. Oh, excellent. That sounds really useful, that the book you've just mentioned in terms of the reader, because we were talking earlier, weren't we, about people, that kind of having a kind of a way, the way, not just the truth, kind of how do I, and ritual being a place of how do you orientate yourself in the world?
Yeah, and I alluded to this earlier, but I do a lot of coaching through my Patreon. I put out weekly pieces, both written and audio. So you can head to my Patreon too from my website. There's a lot of ways to get in touch with me and work with me. I have really active social medias, especially on Instagram. So yeah, just head to the website if you want to know more. It's all there.
Brilliant. Great. Well, just finally then, Maria, just thank you so much for your time and your patience, because I think we've put you through your paces in the last 20 minutes.
That was good. I loved it. I loved it. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. And it's been really good just to get that kind of a little bit of provocation there, to get the depth out of you a bit as well, which we might not get if we just did the 100% agreement thing. So
indeed,
thank you so much for being here and sharing about your book and your ideas and your own personal journey as well.
Yes, thanks for having me. It's really great. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Take care.
You too.
Bye.